Words fill a page, pages fill a chapter, chapters fill a book. Every decision, big and small, writes the story of your life. Unfortunately, some people leave portions of their story unwritten. Sometimes that's why you need to go ahead and take the risk. My story, I decided to go.
I don't know about you, but I'm going to miss her. I thank Life Church TV, the people who put out the Bible app, for making those videos available for us to leverage and use. I found her words to always be full of wisdom, to help inspire me to think about my story in different sorts of ways. And that's what we've been talking about for the past 4 Sundays, is my story, your story, about telling a story that we're glad to tell. And today we're going to focus on a part of telling a story that you're glad to tell, and it's a decision to go. But it might be safer and more comfortable to stay. And if you think about your life, if you're like to go back a few chapters, you would find decisions where you decided to go. You decided to move from that town, or you decided to leave that job, or you decided to go and invest in that relationship, to go get that education, to go to those doctor's appointment or to that therapy appointment, to go improve your health, to go visit somebody. If you look at your story, there's all these decisions to go. Some of them are these big decisions that are hard to miss, like a decision to go to another town, but most of the decisions are these kind of little ones that as you're making them, they don't seem all that significant. But they add up to being quite significant. In fact, you could say that your life is the sum total of the decisions you have made, right? If you think about all the decisions and where you are now, you add them all up, and it is the story that you tell today. Your life is the sum total of the decisions you have made. But it's also true that your life is the sum total of the decisions you did not make. Maybe some decisions you didn't make them and you're better off for them, but I bet you if you were to really go back into your life and look at some of the opportunities that you had, if you could go back 5 years or 10 years, or maybe 1 week or 2 weeks, but there's opportunities that have been part of your story, but you didn't take them. You didn't decide to go. And if you could go back to those moments, then you would take them. Because now, standing where you are, you can see how they would have made such a difference. And for all of us, our lives are a sum total of the decisions we've made, and then these decisions that we did not make, that in retrospect, we wish we would have made. Now, I want to take you to the summer of 1994, and I'm going to tell you a personal story about a decision to go that I almost didn't make. It took me 2 years to make. In 1994, that summer, I was 14 years old. Yeah, that makes me 36. Okay, all right. A 36-year-old up here too, Holland. Right? Summer of 1994, I was a 14-year-old kid who thought he was on top of the world, had an ego about 4 times the size of my actual physical body, and I had just had a great year playing football and then wrestling. I was in my 2nd year as a wrestler, and I was 1 match away from making it to state, which felt pretty good because I was brand new to the sport. And I felt pretty good about it, and I had a coach that felt pretty good about it, and that coach took special interest in me and invited me to go to a camp up in Wisconsin, at the University of Wisconsin. Any Badgers? All right, good. And so I go up to this camp, and it's an intensive wrestling camp. Emphasis on intensive. And where I was 1 match away from going to state, every one of the wrestlers there had made it to state. Quite a few of them had won the state championship. And so my big ego got mocked on the mat by these champion wrestlers. And about 4 days in, I sustained a neck injury. And I could not have been happy. Because it was terrible getting beat up on the mat, so I was happy to go home. And my mom right here, she drove up to Madison, Wisconsin picked me up, drove me home, and I had one of those foam neck braces on. You all know what I'm talking about? Anybody ever wear one of those before? Right? Goofy is all I can say. I felt goofy. I had this big neck brace on. I couldn't wait to get it off. And Mom took me to the doctor, and instead of getting that neck brace off, they put me in a metal neck brace, one step down from a halo. You know, the halo where they drill into your head? I was grateful not to get that, but I had this metal neck brace, and my friends would tease me. They'd say, "Hey, Simmons, what's that over there?" And I'd be like, one of those, because 14-year-old boys aren't very sensitive, and so they kept teasing me. And I was supposed to have a summer where I was just having a great time, causing trouble, being rambunctious. And instead, I was in a neck brace. And I was told that I would never play contact sports again. But you gotta realize that at age 14, my entire identity was built around being a football player and a wrestler. So that was absolutely devastating to me. And I began to rely on God for the first time for strength because everything else I got wasn't good enough. And it was definitely an immature faith, but I was going to church and something was happening. I couldn't define it, but it was helping. And then one Sunday, this group of kids, high school kids from the church that I didn't know because we went to church one town over. But they came home and they had gone on this mission trip. They had gone on the Appalachian Service Project. And this is back in 1994, so what happened next was pretty remarkable. They actually had a video with footage and slides. Now, I think back in 1994, you still had the video camera where it was like up on your shoulder, if you remember. It wasn't like today where you could just take it on your phone with way better video quality. But either way, they showed the video and it was inspiring. You see, this group of teenagers had gone down with some adult leaders and they had gone into the mountain hollers of Appalachia, places like Kentucky and Tennessee, where you don't get cell phone access even today. And they had gone and served some of the most impoverished families in our nation. And they came back full of zeal for service. And it was compelling. And it also was compelling because you could tell that in serving others, something had changed within them. And so I, in my neck brace, struggling to make sense of the way my life was going at that moment, I made a promise to God that if He would help get me through this summer wearing this neck brace, that I would go on that trip. Any of you ever make a promise to God? Right? The rest of you, you're lying. Because when times get tough, we make promises to God. And we say, God, if you get me through, if you do this for me, I will, and I'll stop, and I'll whatever. We do it all the time. But I'm telling you, it's not our promises to God, but it's God's promises to us that really make the difference. Fast forward a few months, I actually ended up not having as bad of an injury as they originally thought. They thought I had a dislocated vertebrae, that I could have been paralyzed, but then they changed their mind, which I was grateful about. I ended up wrestling that winter. And then by the next year, I was playing football as a sophomore and having a great time. And that summer that I was going to go on this trip, that promise I made to God, I didn't go. Because things were going good in my life, so I didn't really need God any longer. Anybody ever been there? I won't make you raise your hand. But there was something inside of me. It wasn't a guilt thing. It wasn't because I broke a promise thing. But there was something in me that was telling me, hey, remember that trip. Remember that feeling you had. Remember seeing those kids on fire for what they had just done serving the Lord and how they seemed changed from that experience. Remember that feeling where you wanted to go. So I signed up. And the next summer, I was set to go on the trip. And I arrived to go with the group that I was supposed to go with, and there was a bunch of kids there from the other town, and they didn't look like the kids I like to hang out with. And then there was these adult leaders, and the woman, she was like overly friendly, like how good Christian women can be, And then the guy, he ended up being brilliant in terms of like instruction and leading our group, but at that moment, the best description I could give, the most generous description, was a grumpy old man. But I went on this trip and it changed my life. And I made a decision to go the next year, and a decision to go the year after that. And then I went off to college, and I thought I was kind of, too hot for, anything to get on me, and things started to go downhill a little bit. I almost failed out of college. Don't tell my church that. But I almost failed out of college. And then I began to turn it around, and I made a decision to go again on ASP as a 21-year-old, and then again as a 22-year-old. And that decision to go, it led me to make the decision to go to seminary, and then go become a youth pastor. And then when I became a youth pastor, I decided, you know where we should go? ASP. And so I got a group of kids together. And it started with a small core. But they started to invite friends. And it began to grow and grow and make impact on people's lives. Some of you might remember this kid, Mark Lentz. I introduced him several months ago. This is Mark, who at this point in time was a teacher in Thailand. And Mark was one of our first volunteers that went on the trip. And I know that this isn't proper protocol, but after I preached about him, I told Mark that I preached about him. You should get permission ahead of time, but he was okay. We ended up having this conversation about the impact of the Appalachian Service Project on his life and his decision to go over Facebook. And this is what Mark said. He said, ASP instilled a desire in me to help and serve other people who need it the most. While that translated into my years on staff, so Mark served as a teenager, and then during college ended up becoming part of the staff of the organization. While that translated into my years on staff, it also influenced my professional life as well. I had always wanted to teach, but had narrowed my focus in college to teaching in low-income communities. Mark now teaches in the inner city of Chicago in some neighborhoods that, quite frankly, you probably don't want to go to. So, that decision to go, many, many years ago, influenced this kid, who's influencing all sorts of other kids. Which brings us to the realization that the decisions that determine your story determine other stories as well. We've been talking about your story throughout this series, and that's really important, but you probably already knew this, but your story and your decisions, they influence and they guide and they determine the stories of others. My decision to go on ASP, it determined the story of several other kids who took the invitation and decided to go as well. This was one of the groups that we had. That's about 65 or 70 people in 2012. They took over 100 people this past year. And I almost didn't go. I almost forgot about it. So what decision to go is in front of you? What decision is God asking you to make? How do you live a story that you and others will be glad to tell? For your story and your decisions, they don't just influence your life, but they can influence the lives of others. All throughout this series, we've been talking about this one scripture. This has been kind of our anchor. And if you want to know how do you live a story that you're glad to tell and that others will be glad to tell with you, we read Hebrews and it says, let us fix our eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith. The first decision you can make is to turn to God, to turn to Christ and say, hey, Lord, help me. Lead my life. Give me a vision. I don't know what to write in this next chapter. I invite you to begin to be the author of my life. I've never met anybody that has made that decision to invite Jesus to be the author of their life who is unhappy that they made that decision. They might have found themselves in places they would have never imagined to find themselves, and have done things that they thought were impossible or not within their preference or within the things they felt gifted for. But those who invite Jesus to be the author, the director, the leader of their life, who constantly are asking that question, they end up in places that they're glad to share about. Once you make that decision, once you make that part of who you are, we've been talking about 4 decisions throughout this series that are kind of the practical application of what you might start to think about when you invited Jesus to be the author of your life. In the first week, we talked about a decision to start a habit or a discipline, a small thing that has the capacity to become a big thing. So, for example, when you pray for God to be the leader of your life, one of the places that God might want to lead you to is financial freedom. And so, therefore, maybe the discipline that you would start is you start budgeting. You start spying on your finances. You watch where your money goes, because when you watch where your money goes, you can make decisions about where it goes. It's a little thing that can lead to a big thing. The week after that, we talked about a decision to stop. Again, this is often a little thing, a habit or a discipline or a way of thinking that we engage in, that if we think about the story that we would be glad to tell, that we think God wants us to tell, we just know that it would be much better if we went ahead and stopped. Stop worrying about things so much. Stop talking bad about people behind their backs. Stop an addiction or a habit. Stop staying up late, like I often do, watching Netflix. Right? Stop. Last week we talked about a decision to stay in a job, in a relationship, on a health plan, on a budget, whatever it might be, but sometimes we are called to make a decision to stay when it would be just so much easier to go, to quit. And so you got to make a decision to stay. And this week, of course, we're talking about a decision to go. And we're going to look at one of the most famous stories about a decision to go from the Bible. It's a story that has influenced people up until this day. It is a story about a man named Abraham, who was first named Abram. And he was in a comfortable place. He was in a place where he knew where to get his hair cut, where to get his oil changed. He knew everything around him. He knew who his neighbors were. But he found God coming into his life, telling him to go, when it would be much easier, much more comfortable to stay. The Lord said to Abram, "Leave your country, your people, your father's household, and go to the land that I will show you." Now don't pass by that too quickly, because he's in a place where he knows, and God's telling him to go to a place where he doesn't know. It's not like him telling you to go to St. Louis and you used to live there and you kind of know people there. He's saying, I'm going to send you to a place I haven't even told you exactly where it is yet, but I'm asking you to go. And I will make you into a great nation. If you do this, if you go, I will make you into a great nation. I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. Now notice something. I will. God is saying, I will do this. I will do that. I will do this for you. Promise, promise, promise. God is saying, if you go, I'm making some promises to you, and you'll end up being a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. And all the peoples on the earth will be blessed through you. To which you're thinking, all the peoples? And God is saying all the peoples. But let me tell you a little bit about all the peoples. Here's you, the orange circle. And the gray is the people you touch. All the peoples in your little universe. And God is saying to Abraham, hey, if you trust me, if you have the courage to go when I tell you to go, even though you don't know exactly where I'm sending you, that all those people in your life, people you never would have imagined, will begin to be blessed by your faithfulness. So Abram left. And the Lord, as the Lord had told him, and Lot, who is his nephew, went with him. Which, remember, your decisions don't just determine your story, but they influence the story of others. Lot went with him. And if you're sitting here thinking, I wish I would have heard this sermon 30 years ago. Back when I had the energy to go. Back when I had enough lifetime in front of me to go. and do something new. Let me just point out, Abram was 75 years old when he set out from Haran. Now, if you're older than 75, take the principle, not the actual number on this, okay? Abraham was not a young man when he decided to leave everything and go. And you don't have to be a young man or a young woman. You might have 30 years left. You might have 30 days left. You might have 3 hours left. We don't know what is left in our lifetime, but what we do know is that God is constantly calling us to go, to step out of our comfort zone, make a big decision, or maybe just a little decision that will make a big impact. So here's the question for you. What does God want you to want? What does He want you to want in this chapter of your life? Have you asked that question? Have you prayed that yet in this sermon series? I bring it up every week. What does God want you to want? Not what your preacher tells you you should want, or your Bible study leader, or your friend down the street, but what does God want you to want? Are you asking God, give me some direction for this chapter of my life? And when you ask this question, when you pray with sincerity of heart, then you begin to ask yourself, what step of faith do you need to take? Because remember, Abram, he doesn't know exactly where he's going, but he can take the step in the direction that God is leading him. So when God calls you to go, it starts with a step in the direction that God is leading you. I'm going to invite up one of our sisters in Christ, Pat Summit, right now. We've been doing this throughout the series, and she's going to talk about a decision that she made to go when it would have been much easier to stay.
It would have been so much easier to stay in that pew. Good morning. I grew up in Shelby County. I went to Triton Central. I got married right out of school. Had a daughter at 20. Lived in Anderson, Indiana for about 20 years. Graduated at the age of 36 from Ball State. And that really cost me my divorce. That no longer fit together. So after my divorce, I moved to Indianapolis, and I found the job of my dreams as a buyer for Allison Gas Turbine, and I bought turbine parts. I was good at my job. I worked hard at learning as much as I could about those gas turbines and engineering, and I worked with engineering and with suppliers, and I loved my job. I was my job. I had accolades from the engineering staff that I worked with and other buyers. I had references from the director of engineering, vice president at Allison. I had a letter of accommodation from the Department of Energy. I was top dog, man. I was good. And about that time, because they were owned by General Motors decided they'd go automotive only. And so they elected to sell Allison Gas Turbine. And they had a management buyout. And about 10 months later, because they were a foreign entity, they could buy them from a private company. So they sold Allison to Rolls-Royce. And because Rolls-Royce already made engines, we had a duplication of efforts. And suddenly, I was unceremoniously told, "I'm sorry, you are redundant. We don't have a place for you at Rolls-Royce." I cannot explain what a downward spiral that did. I was bereft. I couldn't function. My life stopped. And I was feeling discarded. And about that time, Indiana started job support offices. You could go in and they'd give you free use of computers and phones and everything. They would teach you how to interview. They would do all of these things for you. And they made me go because I'm unemployed. So I went. I met others who, believe it or not, had the same thing happen to them. I couldn't believe it. And I learned computer skills. I learned to get rid of my anger, my self-defeat, and I came out of my shell because I was coached and interacted with others. I interviewed. You couldn't believe it took 9 months, and I went from anger and nastiness to being grateful that I had the skills, and I interviewed and was offered a job in New York. The job, my choices were that I had this wonderful job that paid really good. They would give me a down payment for my home and set up all the financing. And in addition, they came and packed my stuff up, moved all my furniture and everything. I just had to show up in the new place. Well, that was my offer. The only problem was all my friends and family were in Indiana, in central Indiana. And I was caught in a dilemma. Do I step out there because none of my family and friends traveled and moved? They stuck it out and they had jobs here. So I could either stay and be part of my family and friends and find something, or I could step out there and go states away with no one that I know. I chose to go.
So I just want to take a moment or two to close this off. And that was quite a story of going. And as many of you know, that often we have these decisions in our life where we feel a need to go. And we do that. And then there's another decision and another challenge. So these things keep coming our way. But the thing that will get you through is this faith. And part of Pat's story, I mean, it was doing what she could do. She could accept the offer or not, and then there needs to be a level of trust in God, but only God can do. It is by faith that we are able to go, that we're able to stretch beyond where we are, to take the risk, to invite that new chapter, to go to that new place, even though we don't know exactly where it might be. Do and trust. Do and trust. That is faith. And Abraham, the Hebrew writer says, by faith, Abraham, when called to go to a place he would later receive as his inheritance, obeyed and went. Called to go. He received the call. He trusted the call. And then he obeyed and went. He did the do. He applied it. He took action. Even though he did not know where he was going. Trust him. Sometimes we don't see what's in front of us, but we feel the need to go, get outside of the comfort zone, to try something different. Abraham received the call, and he obeyed and went. God is calling you to go somewhere today. I don't know where it is, but he's making a promise to you. He's saying if you go here, you will be a blessing. It will change you. It will change others. We are changed by believing God's promises to us. And if you receive his promise and decide to go, there will be a blessing. But the real question is this what you really want? Do you really want God to lead your life? Do you really want to follow? Do you really trust that God has a place for you? And so I normally end by praying for all of you, but today I'm going to ask you to bow your heads. We're going to just have a moment of silence. So if you haven't prayed to God, God, what do you want me to want? Can you give me a direction? Lead my life. If that's where your heart is, I invite you to pray that prayer now, today, asking for God's guidance. Would you pray silently